we're dealing with the line of the priests, comparing it to the line of the 144,000, and we're seeing that this is a quasi-fractal waymark of the second advent. The death decree is a quasi-fractal waymark, therefore you would expect the shut door to be a quasi-fractal waymark. They're similar in the principal points, but there is not an exactness. The line of the 144,000 was broken down into self-similar parts. Those self-similar parts we often refer to as the line of the priests, the Levites, and the Nethinims. And what we have done is we've taken a whole expanse of history if I can do it down here, we have this whole expanse of history from 4 BC to 100 AD. 4 BC to 100 AD. This is the end of ancient Israel. And through this history, there's a lot that happens. And we're taking this whole expanse of history as a parable of our own, and we compare and contrast. So we see the time of the end, we see the baptism of Christ, 27 AD. I'm aware in this top line we started to blend the two. First temple cleansing, cross, Pentecost, destruction of Jerusalem. And all the events that happened inside here, the ascension, the upper room, the triumphal entry. And people are still discovering more about that history and putting it into place. But we have the whole end of ancient Israel, and we've treated that as a parable. We compare and contrast it, and we can bring it to here. End of ancient Israel, end of modern Israel. What we don't do is start to fractalize this in an exact self-similar way. So we don't take this cross lines up perfectly here. We don't take this cross and start to fractalize it and say, it's here for the priests, the cross must be here for the Levites. Does that make sense? This is just revision from what we did last week. We're taking the whole of that history as a parable of our own and fractalizing that history. But we don't start manipulating this history, stretching it to fit these different fractals. So we don't take this history and squish it into the line of the Gentiles and make this 4 BC, this 27 AD, this the temple cleansing, and this the cross. We don't take this line and squish it together to fit a fractal. Is everyone okay with that? People are saying yes. And you can see that you can't do that because the disciples have this experience here of the cross, and when they go through that experience, it's the beginning of their harvest. It's the beginning of their time of trouble. For the first group called, and they experience a disappointment, not a mistake in the message, but there's still a disappointment. They don't understand what's happening. It's a dangerous, heart-wrenching situation that they're placed in. They're scattered, they flee, they go back to their original occupations. In 34 AD, at the stoning of Stephen, do the Gentiles go through any of that experience? No, because you can't take this waymark of the cross and start placing it at different fractal levels and making it exact self-similar. This fractal of the first group is self-similar to the fractal of the third group. But if you were to say they're exact self-similar, you would take the experience of the disciples here and you would put it down here for the Gentiles in 34 AD and expect the Gentiles to go through the same experience. And they simply don't do that. So this line of the disciples is not exact self-similar to the reform line of the Gentiles. And we dealt with that when we started dealing with change of leadership. The disciples have a change of leadership here at the first temple cleansing. The fact that they have a change of leadership here, does that mean that there's a change of leadership here? And we said no, because we're taking a whole history, comparing and contrasting it with our own. There is no internal change of leadership in 34 AD, and these are not exact self-similar fractals. So the fact there is a change of leadership here, there is not internal to the movement, but within the reform line of the Levites, a change of leadership here. There is a change of leadership for the Gentiles in 34 AD. Sorry, at Pentecost, which they understand progressively, and we discussed that last week as well. So there is a change of leadership for the first group, second group, third group, not in exact ways, but in self-similar, quasi ways, but there is no internal change of leadership in 34 AD. One of the reasons I didn't want to just answer that question simply, because I think we can understand our reform lines better by seeing how they have been constructed. Brother Brendan, it's the exact point. The harvest is there in principle for both groups, but it looks very different for both groups. The beginning of the harvest for the disciples looks very different to the beginning of the harvest for the Gentiles. They're both going to go through a time of trouble. The Gentiles experienced persecution between 34 and 70 AD. But it is not exact. It has principal parts that have likeness. So we're going to do a revision now I'm just going to go back to the very beginning and step through in a shorter time frame for those of us who have just joined. And for those of us who have just joined, one of the problems that we've experienced is the daylight saving has changed in Australia, which has brought us back an hour. So I'm sorry for those who have missed us. To do a revision, going back to the very beginning. People have been asking a question about the change of leadership. If Donald Trump is not the last president of the United States, what does that do to the study presented last year, which compare and contrasts the change of leadership externally in 14 to 19 with a change of leadership internally from 14 to 19. And instead of going straight into that question, I wanted to first give an explanation of how our reform lines are constructed. And we began by looking at the definition of a fractal. We simplified it down and addressed two types of fractals that I would suggest you could squish fractals into, not ignoring their complexities. An exact self-similar fractal and a quasi-self-similar fractal. If we had a not online audience, this is when I would ask people to come up and someone else to do the revision, but I can't do that. We looked at the definition of similar. Some people gave some thoughts. Then we went to the Merriam-Webster's definition of similar, and it says similar means that these items are alike in form or appearance. Similar may signify exactly alike or having a general likeness. So you can have two things that are similar, and what you mean is that they are exactly alike. If I had an identical twin, you might say that we are exact self-similar, depending on how precise you want it to be. These two pens are exact self-similar. Exactly similar. They're exactly alike. These two pens are also similar. They are not exact, but they have a general likeness, a likeness in principal points. They're alike in structure, in pattern, in size. They are not alike in colour. So you have similar as being quite a broad term. It can mean exact, or it can mean just similar in principal parts. So we asked for a fractal, what are the things that are similar? Because if you have something that's similar, if I said this is similar, what am I lacking? I'm lacking something to compare it to. You must have at least two items to say that something is similar. It has to be similar to something. So what is, in the definition of a fractal, what is being termed similar? And we saw that that is the self. It's the self that is similar. So I could say that this is one self. I still can't say that it's similar. So if something is self-similar, you have to break it, so you have two parts. We did that here. This structure is one structure. You could say that it's just one structure and it is a self, one self. Mute. So it's one self, and then if you want to say it's similar, you have to start breaking it so you have parts to compare it to. So now if you break it, you can say that this broken part is similar to this broken part of the one self. I might be doing a bad job here, but I hope that makes sense in concept. One self with parts that are similar to each other, so it's self-similar. Then we discussed how prevalent this is in nature. You see it all through nature as repeating patterns in repeating structures. And to go through them quite quickly, we'll just skip through them quite quickly. We looked at nature, the different self-similar examples shown in nature. A dandelion is a good example. If you were to pull out one of those spokes, it would be self-similar to the whole and self-similar to all of those other spikes. Another one that is really quite neat is a fern leaf. Some of us in tropical climates would see these all around them. What you are looking at, perhaps without realizing it, is fractals all through nature. You can cut that up into individual components and see that they are self-similar, repeating patterns. We looked at another common one used is romesco broccoli. Broccoli itself is a neat fractal if you tear off a floret, but they can be quite different in shape. So people prefer to use this example. Mathematicians prefer this version of broccoli that at least here is much more rare, because the similarity of the parts is much more exact. So this is seen as a fractal. It's something that is seen particularly well in snowflakes or all different ice crystals. They tend to form fractal patterns. And lastly, we dealt with one that is not found in nature. This was a major step in the study of fractals called the Mandelbrot set. And I'm not meaning to go into a technical explanation of how fractals are studied in mathematics, except to say that it involves deep mathematical studies of geometry that really became into a life of their own in the 1970s once they were able to be calculated with IBM computers and developing technology. So this is an example. It's quite a big deal. I don't know why, but I'm told it is, so I'm telling you that it is. And it's really quite a mathematical equation that enables this to be formed on a computer, where you could zoom in infinitely and just see a continuously repeating pattern at different sizes, at different stages. So we'll end share now. Fractals, the study of fractals and the naming of them as fractals took place in 1975. The naming of that branch of mathematics and geometry. That Mandelbrot set was a major step in identifying how they are constructed, and that was presented by Benoit Mandelbrot in 1979, and he became really the father of the study of fractals, although he's unpopular in some areas of the scientific community. So it's quite a new field of science. And what they're recognizing is why they might be studying the geometry and the mathematics of fractals quite late in history. There's something that is so prevalent in the external world. This took place in the 1970s, escalating through the 1980s and 90s. And that was as much of the history as I want to review. But to address how it's impacted this movement, in 1989 we're given the study of reform lines, and it's just this one simple structure. The idea of a time of the end and a gathering of God's people. And over the last 31 years now, it has developed from something that you could say it was simple, but I would also say it's messy. And if something is messy, it's not simple. I actually think that as it may look more complicated, this may look more complicated, with understanding it's actually more simple, because it has structure and integrity. There's complexity to something that isn't clear. In 1989, we're given reform lines. And when it comes to end of ancient Israel or end of modern Israel, it's just one singular line, the gathering of God's people. And then over 31 years, it's increasingly refined as we advance in knowledge. Particularly beginning in 2014, with the study of Ezra 7:9, what people begin to identify is that if you take this reform line and you break it, let's say that you break it at the Sunday law. Now you have a part of that original reform line. And what people began to identify is if you break it, this part is self-similar to the whole. Over time, it may be termed incorrectly with different terms like the church and the world, that it still holds true today but has been refined to such a degree. But they started seeing you could break this reform line and see self-similar parts, so they termed them fractals. So with Ezra 7:9, the study of the priests, Levites and Nethinims, they understood that if you took the line of the 144,000, you could break it down into individual parts of the one self, parts of the one history, and find that those parts are self-similar to each other and self-similar to the whole. Is everyone with me? Even if you're new and you've missed something, if something hasn't made sense, if you can mention it in the chat. So I'm seeing some new people who've joined saying yes. Brother Deng says okay. Is that a yes? I don't want it to just be okay. If there's something that isn't clear, let me know. Okay, so we have one self, one history from 1989 to the Second Advent. You could say another line from 4 BC to 100 AD, and it's getting broken down into parts, and they are self-similar parts to the whole. And then the issue we face is they're self-similar, but are they exact self-similar, or are they quasi-self-similar? And this really came to a head last year when we started speaking about, in the history of the Midnight Cry, about the close of probation we were about to face as priests and the nature of the close of probation. So when we come to 2019, what Elder Jeff and FFA start saying is that this, correctly, 2019 is a fractal level of Daniel 12:1. So it is self-similar to Daniel 12:1. And where we started to divide with them, one of the issues is this self-similarity between 2019 and Daniel 12:1 exact or quasi, partial, similar in its nature, in major characteristics. FFA said it's exact self-similar. Michael stands up, probation closes for this group of people. And we started to say, hold on, we're already identifying 2021 as the Second Advent, self-similar to the Second Advent on the line of the 144,000, and no one, not FFA, not Elder Jeff, not ourselves, would say that this is exact. Christ is not coming back to take the priests home. If he did, who gives the message to the Levites? Because their harvest begins here. The disciples go back to the church at Pentecost. If we go to heaven, we can't do that. 2021 is not exact self-similar to the Second Advent, but it has characteristics in common. At the Second Advent, the 144,000 go to work. There's all of these people that have been raised from the dead who go to heaven, who don't know that they're meant to not walk around naked, not eat meat, not practice sexism, Sarah does not get to call Abraham Lord in heaven. They need education. So the 144,000 are going to go to work as teachers. So we see at 2021, we go to work as teachers. So there is a similarity between these two waymarks, but it is not exact, it's 𝗂𝗲𝗄𝗃. And if we're going to be consistent, this is 𝗂𝗲𝗄𝗃, this is 𝗂𝗂𝗃. It's a not exact self-similar. Michael does not stand up twice. He also doesn't come back to earth and take people back twice. So they started showing inconsistency in their methodology. An inconsistency that was also quite stubborn. At least as of the last information, they still have not let go of their belief that this was an absolute hard close of probation, no intercession from here on from anyone who was in or has left this movement. Death decree. It is self-similar to the death decree on the line of the 144,000, but it is not exact. We have not faced death decrees in our own countries. At the same time, we have experienced a time of trouble. I would suggest on a global scale that for at least those now living, unless there's some people here who went through World War II, a time of trouble not seen. I did mention, without trying to make some absolute application, we've been through that death decree concord waymark, and it's been all about death. Whether it's the pandemic, whether it's Ruth Bader Ginsburg or John Lewis, it's been all about death, or Floyd. It began with the death of George Floyd, and it was all about death. Just a side note. It has been a time of trouble. It's been a time of harvest. It's been a time when people who oppose this movement have come into unity on nothing else except their opposition to us, all of which are associated with the death decree. So that waymark has a likeness in principal points, but it is not exact self-similar. The line of the priests is not exact self-similar to the line of the 144,000. But the line of the priests is also not exact self-similar to the line of the world or the Gentiles. Then those fractals are not even exact self-similar to each other, because we're taking a whole expanse of history. And this is where in our study, still doing revision, we went back to the line of the end of ancient Israel. And we saw that we have taken a period of history from 4 BC, the time of the end, the birth of John the Baptist, to 100 AD, when Christ comes a second time to the Isle of Patmos. And we've treated it as a parable, comparing and contrasting end of ancient Israel with end of modern Israel. It's a whole expanse of history overlaid. So when you see the experience of the disciples, it is not exact self-similar to the experience of the Gentiles. And this is also revision of last week. We place the cross at the beginning of the time of trouble for the disciples. It's their shut door test. This understanding of how to use the end of ancient Israel. Those who left the movement also had to disagree with this simple example of compare and contrast of reform lines, because we all know that the close of probation for the disciples morally was not the cross. They made major mistakes after that history, and they still continued as God's leaders and teachers. So the cross lines up here, and if we were to make this the experience of the Gentiles, an exact self-similar fractal of the line of the disciples, you would have to manipulate this history. You would have to take the end of ancient Israel and squish it condense it into the line of the Gentiles and say that their time of the end was the experience of 4 BC, that they experienced a temple cleansing at Pentecost, that they then went through the experience of the cross at this waymark, and it just didn't happen. The experience of the disciples at the beginning of their harvest, at the cross, the pain, the disappointment, the misunderstandings, the scattering. The Gentiles aren't scattered at 34 AD. They begin to be drawn in. The disciples were already in the movement. They're scattered at the cross, and then God needs to bring them back. Jesus needed to draw them back together again. So there is a difference in the experience of all the three groups of people. The disciples have a different experience to those of the second group of the Jews who are called, who have a different experience to the Gentiles, because their experiences are different does not mean they are not self-similar. They all went through a ploughing, an early rain, a latter rain, a harvest. They all went through a time of trouble, whether it's the disciples in the upper room barring the doors, fearing for their lives, whether it's the Jews between Pentecost and 34 AD who were joined the movement and were cast out of their churches, disinherited from their families, whether it is the Gentiles from 34 to 70 AD who experienced the persecution of Rome and Nero, or it's John from 70 to 100 who was thrown in boiling oil. They all went through a time of trouble. Not exact self-similar, but similar in its principal parts. Does that make sense? Different experience, but there is still a repeating pattern of similarity. So we wanted to put all of that in place. If anyone has thoughts or questions, please, even if you're new and you feel you've missed, don't be afraid to contribute. So what we need to truly understand the experience of these groups of people is not to make exact comparisons with our own experience. What we need to do is we need these histories to give us a compare and contrast of what will happen at Pentecost, at 2021. But parables themselves, when they compare and contrast two things, which is again the same idea of comparing and contrasting similarity, fractals are parables exact self-similar? Are Christ's parables exact self-similar? Or exact similar? Probably can't use the word self. No. A sheep is not exactly similar to you or I, but it has similarity in principal parts. So it's a component of parable teaching to use this idea of 𝗂𝗄𝗄. It doesn't mean that something is imperfect or that there's something wrong with it. It is how Christ teaches. So Christ is going to use two things that are not that alike and draw out the similarities from both of them to teach us a lesson. He's going to take how the sheep, how a shepherd loves and searches for his sheep, to show how he would love and search for us when we're lost. Shepherd and sheep is not exactly similar to our relationship and our relation to Christ. It's not what we look like. It's not what we act like. But he's able to take two quasi-similar things and draw a lesson from them. The line of the end of ancient Israel is not exact similar to our own line. There were things that happened in their history that will not happen in our history or are going to look markedly different. And yet we can draw out from this history all of the neat, complex similarities between their experience and our experience. But this parable, this compare and contrast, is not exact similar. It's quasi-similar. And then when we come into our own history and we deal with one self, one history, and we start splitting it, we find it's also not exact similar. It's similar in that parable mentality of having a traceable likeness, a repeating pattern, but not in exact details. So we wanted to have that discussion before speaking about the change of leadership, that there's an internal change of leadership at the first temple cleansing. You already have the introduction of Christ to the movement at the baptism. At the first temple cleansing, you have his official work begin, and disciples had to turn and follow him. Then with the Jews at the cross, the veil is torn in the temple. There's a change of leadership in that structure. There is no recognized in the eyes of God leadership of the Jewish nation. That has all been passed over to the disciples. This second group of the Jews that are called, they're going to understand that later on. It's going to take them time to understand that. But that takes place here, middle way mark, when the veil is torn. For the Gentiles at Pentecost, their leadership has already changed. It's going to take them time to understand it. So these other two groups, these other two fractals, do experience a change of leadership at that middle way mark. It only changes internally in that history at one point in time, and that is at the first temple cleansing. 34 AD, you do not have that repeated. And the reason that people were feeling uncertain about that study about the change of leadership, I would suggest, is because of this confusion about how we handle fractals and what we expect to see when we look at a fractal, whether without understanding all the technicalities of how fractals are constructed, how they are when it comes to exactness or a general likeness. Just before we close, a couple of comments from people. Sister Marilyn says how different a fern in its details looks under magnification. For example, with a microscope, differences are seen. Yes, you would see those differences. If you want a real exact self-similar fractal, you tend to need a computer, which is why they suggest that branch of science developed so late. Brother Troy says, Pentecost, for example, in our dispensation, we won't see cloven tongues. No, we won't. And yet it's still, we will identify a general likeness. And we will trace through a parable structure, a compare and contrast using the rules of parable teaching. Parable teaching which uses quasi-similarity to make a point. We will be able to draw out what that similarity is at Paneum. If you kneel with me, we will close in prayer. I am out of time. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for your blessings. Father, sometimes these studies for people, we know that it can feel like we are just looking at things so separate from inspiration. People complain, where are the Bible quotes? Where are the quotes of Ellen White? And yet we see that in a study of reform lines, it draws us straight back to nature and nature's God. That we are just looking at parables you've already put in the structure of ferns and of coasts of the sea lion, of seashells, of ice crystals under magnification. Lord, we are amazed at nature and nature's God. We see you, Lord, more clearly in nature, and I pray that through these studies we will see you more clearly in reform lines, that we can trace your hand in all of these studies in how you're trying to teach your people. That this is not some type of foreign message, that you are not doing something strange and new. You are using the same rules and methodology that you implanted into creation. I pray, Lord, that we'll become more comfortable, more familiar with these concepts, and through them we will understand not just the external events, not just elections and what needs to happen, but all of this, Lord, is with the intent to understand nature's God. I pray, Lord, that we will understand your character and that we might be willing to unlearn anything necessary to have that clear view. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.